Okay, we're talking about the Bible. We're looking at evidence for the Bible's inspiration, that it is a book from God. And we, of course, started with predictive prophecy. And again, none of these subjects are being treated exhaustively. I don't know that you could treat them exhaustively, but you certainly could take each one and spend several weeks on it. We did that a few years back with prophecy. But we've been looking at its scientific accuracy and foreknowledge, and that's really two different things. One we would expect is, even though the Bible is not a scientific medical textbook, we would expect that when it does touch on these subjects, that it would not include the superstitions and the incorrect beliefs of the people of that day in which it was written. So when we read the Pentateuch, for instance, written by Moses approximately 3,500 years ago, we don't see those kinds of mistakes. In fact, we see some things talked about, given by God, that are scientifically or medically accurate even today, and will always be, because they're given by God. And also, we might even see some things that deal in the fact of foreknowledge, things that were not known, even to man until the last maybe 50, 100, 150 years. And so we had looked at several laws there and various items. And then we got to number 4, which was medical acumen. And I think we've looked at all of those things, including laws of food consumption. And that got us down to our last point there, under scientific accuracy and foreknowledge, which is circumcision. This tradition, or this act of circumcision. You recall that when God chose Abraham and his descendants to be a special people, they would be separate and apart from the nations around them. God, when he made this covenant with Abraham, included a physical sign. And this physical sign was to be implemented not only to Abraham's family, but to all future generations of his descendants. And so let's go over to Genesis chapter 17. And we'll begin at about verse 12 of Genesis 17. Where it says, "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So we see this covenant of circumcision, or part of the covenant was this physical sign of circumcision. We find out later, of course, that the circumcision of a male, a newborn male, was to take place on a certain day. Eighth day, right, 8th day. So, 2 things we need to note with regard to circumcision, and as far as the Bible's medical acumen. Number 1, from what modern medicine has been able to gather, circumcision lessens the chances of getting certain diseases and infections. Now, I know that that's sometimes disputed. I don't know what kind of groups these are. I don't know what you call them. I don't know if they're right-wing, left-wing, libertarians, what you would call them. But, for instance, the ones who, refuse to vaccinate their children. So now we have to deal with a population increasingly that's contracting diseases that we thought we eradicated, 100 years ago, because, vaccines are supposedly bad for you. Well, I understand there's a risk, a small percentage risk. It's amazing to me, though, that you can get upset about these things, but if you told these people they need surgery or something, well, they would have it, even though there are several risks. And there's always a risk with surgery. I mean, I know sometimes we assume in this modern age in which we live that, most surgeries are routine, but surgery is never routine in that sense. There was an actor, Bill Paxton. I don't know if y'all remember Bill Paxton, but pretty well-known actor. You can see him in a lot of movies. Well, he was in his 50s. He went in for some kind of surgery a couple of years ago. He didn't wake up. And I don't think this was like, I don't know, but I don't know that it was anything that you would think, oh, I'm not going to come out of this. Recently, I had a lady that worked part-time for me, very recently, in the last week or so, that she had the flu for a couple of weeks and was sick. Well, then she kind of had a relapse, went to the doctor, and they did a scan, found she had 2 blood clots. Well, I guess she's probably 60, in her early 60s. So they said, well, you got to go in go get these taken care of. So they go over to Methodist Germantown and take her back and take care of her blood clots, and on the way back to her room, her heart stops, and she died. So, but these people will have that kind of thing done, but for some reason, vaccinations are dangerous. I don't know. But, and now you got all these protesting against circumcision. You're abusing the baby or something, or you're,
But they don't have a problem going and getting ears pierced or tattoos and all of that stuff.
Well, of course, the argument is, well, the baby can't decide. Well, what kind of argument is that? If you're a parent, how many things does a baby decide for himself? Ever. And the number 2, of course, these same people, I suspect, the same people that have a problem with circumcising and abusing babies don't have a problem with killing the babies. So that's a little inconsistent. But there are medical reasons for circumcision. It substantially reduces the incidence of urinary tract infection in boys, especially those under 1 year of age. Some studies have cited in the pediatric circles that 10 to 20 times more urinary tract infections in uncircumcised compared with circumcised boys. Also, sexually transmitted diseases are passed more readily among men who have not been circumcised. Those nations, the Amorite nations that lived in the land of Canaan, were morally bankrupt, and I'm sure diseased as well. When God said, this land is vomiting these people out, and I've got to cleanse this land of these people. People get all upset because the Israelites killed every man, woman, and child, and yet these children were going to be reared by immoral, nasty people. Now they don't have to worry about that. But circumcision also, according to research, basically eliminates the chance of penile cancer. It's virtually abolished the risk. It almost always occurs in uncircumcised men. So there are medical benefits of circumcision, number 1. By the way, some of this material that was written about these benefits has been written by people in the medical community who have an evolutionary bias. They didn't write it, thank God for how smart he was back in the Old Testament. So there's a lot of health benefits. But second, the day that it's implemented, of course, is of extreme importance. And I think most of you have heard this, but this is from Hope Pediatrics, a big-time influential work about child care, pediatric health concerns. It was first written in 1896 by a guy by the name of Emmett Holt, and it's went through a bunch of revisions up through the 50s. It's about 1,500 pages. But starting on page 125 of the 12th edition is titled Hemorrhagic Disease of the Newborn. It says the occurrence of occasional spontaneous bleeding among newborns that can sometimes cause severe damage to major organs such as the brain and even death. And the reasons for such bleeding, the author state, is primarily caused by a decreased level of prothrombin, which in turn is caused by insufficient levels of vitamin K. The child's susceptibility is higher between the 2nd and 5th days of life. And they have a chart in there that shows that the percent of available prothrombin in newborn dips from about 90% of normal on its birth date to about 35% on the 3rd day of life outside the womb. But after the 3rd day, it starts to climb, and by the 8th day, that available level is approximately 110% of normal, which is about 20% higher than it was on the 1st day, and about 10% more than it will be the rest of the child's life. And so, bottom line is, if you're going to do major surgery on an infant, the day to do it is what? The 8th day. For bleeding purposes. Well, so you have to ask the question then, well, how did Moses know that? Well, he experimented, right? He took thousands of newborns and circumcised them on different days. Decided, well, they bleed a lot this day and they don't bleed that. No, that's not what he did. God told him that was the best day to do it. And so, again, circumcision is one of those unique laws, medical procedures we find in the Bible that for 2 reasons show its amazing medical acumen in a time where those people wouldn't know anything about that. So medically accurate, not a medical textbook, but accurate when it speaks as to medical issues. So that finishes us out on scientific accuracy and foreknowledge. Number C there, our third evidence for the Bible's inspiration, a book from Jehovah, is its factual accuracy. And we won't spend a lot of time on this because, frankly, this leads us into the next one, D, which is archaeological evidence, because really the two are tied together. If you're looking at the factual accuracy of the Bible, certainly you can look at some secular writings of the day, and I certainly wouldn't judge the Bible by secular writings, although it is interesting, that you can read the works of people like Josephus, or even Roman historians like Tacitus, which confirm, various historical events that the Bible discusses. Sometimes people with and I guess some radicals still do, but nobody in their right mind, for instance, argues that Jesus Christ never lived. Now, they might argue whether he was the Son of God, but as to whether there was an actual person named Jesus, a first-century Jew that lived in Palestine, well, you would also have to deny, if they're not going to do this, the people that hate the Bible are not going to deny secular sources because his name is mentioned by Josephus and Tacitus and others, writers. But really, archaeology really helps us in this area. But it's interesting. History textbooks are kind of like science textbooks when it comes to school. If I picked up the average history textbook, it would, I looked inside the copyright on the first page. It's going to usually tell me what? Yeah, but more than that. It's usually going to say it's what edition?
9th, 10th, 11th.
Yeah. 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th. I mean, they change all the time. Now, scientific textbooks change all the time because we find out things we didn't know before. Maybe we were wrong about some things. We do the same thing with history books. Number one, history doesn't stop. I mean, If I write a history book today, well, 5 years from now, history's changed. So there's obviously things to be included that I couldn't have included, a few years before. And then sometimes they actually find that maybe they find a little more updated history. Things get found. Old documents, letters, writings, things they find that may sharpen our understanding of particular places, people, and events. And then sometimes they just rewrite it because they don't like it, unfortunately. But nevertheless, they change. So,
also, Brother Greg, I think it would be impossible always, it depends on what your thesis is, obviously, to include everything.
oh,
I
absolutely.
think John said the world could not contain all of the things.
That's right. And we can't,
So,
if you get it's kind of like this. You can go to college and you can major in history and you can take all kinds of classes. Western civilization from 1100 AD to 1500. I mean, it's broken down into about as condensed or as specific as you want. So you're right. There's no way to, and if I'm talking about one general history book, it's going to cover the history of the world. That's kind of difficult to do, very specific. And same thing with the Bible. It doesn't contain everything. You could never contain everything that was done by everybody in every place. Certainly not by Christ. But the point is that when the Bible states that something happened historically, I can read a history book that may just simply be wrong about a particular event as to what happened. It may have bad information. But when I read the Bible, if it states that something happened historically, factually, then it's going to be accurate if it's from the God of heaven. And there are people, of course, that go at it with the idea that there's all these mistakes, but it's up to them to find them. Tell us what they are. And that's been very difficult. It always amuses me, some of the so-called contradictions they come up with, because they don't understand English. They don't understand how the Oriental mind worked when it wrote. And they don't give it the same benefit of the doubt that they do other ancient writings, of course. But, so for instance, one of the books that was panned for years by critics was the book of Acts. It's called the book of Acts. Now, why would it be so easy to criticize the book of Acts? Why would that be so easy? If I wanted to take issue with a book and see if I could find some mistakes, why would I go to Acts? Yeah, it's full of history. It's full of it. I mean, I can go to a book like Ephesians or Galatians or Hebrews, great doctrinal treatises, Romans, and I may not find hardly a lick of history or factual data in it. I may get to the end and there may be some salutations to some people, but not a whole lot to check or to dispute. But if I wanted to dispute something or take issue with something, man, I go to the book of Acts. Which brings us to Sir William Ramsay, who was one time an unbeliever and a world-class archaeologist. And, of course, he had been trained that under the scholarship that he studied, Acts was riddled with mistakes, not reliable. And so, now, Ramsay lived from 1851 to 1939, and he, of course, questioned the historicity of Acts because that's what he'd always been taught. So he has this built-in prejudice. And this is a statement from Ramsay himself. About 1880 to 1890, the book of Acts was regarded as the weakest part of the New Testament. No one that had any regard for his reputation as a scholar cared to say a word in its defense. The most conservative of theological scholars, as a rule, thought the wisest plan of defense for the New Testament as a whole was to say as little as possible about the Acts. That's what he wrote in 1950. So, he had the same view. But he did something that nobody else was willing to do. Remember I said Ramsey was a world-class archaeologist. So, he said, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the Bible lands and I'm going to do my own digging, my own research, and see what I find. Because his intention, of course, was to show, yeah, it's inaccurate. Luke's an inaccurate historian. But he then came to the opposite conclusion, and before he died became a believer in the Bible. He wrote, I had read a good deal of modern criticism about the book, and dutifully accepted the current opinion that it was written during the second half of the 2nd century by an author who wished to influence the minds of people in his own time by a highly wrought and imaginative description of the early church. His object was not to present a trustworthy picture of facts in the period about AD 50, but to produce a certain effect on his own time by setting forth a carefully colored account of events and persons of that older period. He wrote for his contemporaries, not for truth. That's what Ramsey thought. And that's what he'd been taught. So, he goes and he spends all this years digging and searching. And after all of that, let me read you a couple of statements. And some of this is in the introduction to Acts in Brother Jackson, Wayne Jackson's commentary. He says, the present writer, Ramsey speaking, takes the view that Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. At this point, we are describing what reasons and arguments changed the mind of one who began under the impression that the history was written long after the events and that it was untrustworthy as a whole. He says, the more I've studied the narrative of the Acts and the more I've learned year after year about Greco-Roman society and thoughts and fashions and organization in those provinces, the more I admire and the better I understand. I set out to look for truth on the borderland where Greece and Asia meet and found it here, talking about in the book of Acts. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment, provided always that the critic knows the subject and does not go beyond the limits of science and of justice. And so now Luke is regarded and widely acknowledged as an extremely accurate historian, due much to Ramsey's work. And here's the thing. If you're going to write a book and you don't want somebody to question faction, you say, oh, everything in here is true. And you don't want anybody to question it. What would you do? How would you write as far as things you would mention historically? You would avoid as many details as possible. And yet in this quote in Brother Jackson's commentary, he makes a good point. He mentions, Luke does in the book of Acts, 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 Mediterranean islands. He alludes to 95 different people, 62 of which are not mentioned by any other New Testament writer. 27 of these are unbelievers, chiefly civil or military officials. So, can you check that for accuracy? Absolutely. I can remember reading one, and I don't remember the exact answer, but there, for instance, there's one part of Luke, I think it was in Ephesians, where he mentions Asiarchs, a certain particular political position, and nobody had ever heard of that in the historical world. And guess what they found when they were doing some archaeological digging on some of the city posts or something? References to Asiarchs. There was another place where I think he calls Sergius Paulus what? Was he proconsul? And there was an argument, no, at that time, that particular part of Cyprus was not under, and I can't remember if a proconsul is appointed by the Senate or by the emperor. But you understand that in Roman times, your province was either governed by the Senate or the emperor, and depending upon what government you were under was depending on what they called the head guy. So he was proconsul in one, and I'm trying to think of the other term. Not governor, though. Governor is an English term, so Pontius Pilate was not a governor in that sense. That may be the closest thing we can think of. That's not what the Romans called it. Propraetor or proconsul, something of that nature. So the argument was, look, Luke got it wrong because then after they did all this research, they found out, guess what? At that particular time frame, when Luke wrote, when Paul was there, Sergius Paulus was a proconsul. It changed hands from Senate to emperor over some period of time. And so those are the kinds of facts we're talking about. And so if you wanted to disprove the factual accuracy of the Bible, Acts would be the place you should be able to do it. If you go through what I just read you, all the names of these countries, cities, people, and yet they can't do it. There's been others that have mentioned it. J.B. Lightfoot, one of the greatest scholars of his day, 1828 to 1889. He was fluent in 7 languages. Made a lot of contributions to the literature of the New Testament. He said of Acts, no ancient work affords so many tests of veracity. For no other has such numerous points of contact in all directions with contemporary history, politics, and topography, whether Jewish, Greek, or Roman. In more recent days, Henry J. Cadbury, liberal scholar of Harvard University, authored a volume entitled The Book of Acts and History, in which he introduced many examples of the amazing accuracy of Luke's second letter to Theophilus. His first letter, of course, being the book of Luke. Factual accuracy. If the Bible is the Word of God, it's going to be factually accurate any place you can check it. Now, there's some things we can't check. There are some historical events and names that we have yet been able to check just because civilizations get destroyed and obliterated through history. And so that's going to kind of lead us into our next, well, just to give you an example before we get to the next topic. Everybody that's familiar with the death of Christ is familiar with the infamous governor, if you will, of Judea, whose name was what? The Roman official was Pontius Pilate. And the Bible mentions Pilate several times, but for years they could not find his name in the archaeological evidence. So if you can't find it, even though you would have to actually say, we've dug up everything there is to dig up before you can make this conclusion. But as usual, if critics say, well, we haven't found it at this point, then what do they say? What's their position? Well, yeah, the Bible's inaccurate. It's wrong. As if they've all found everything. Well, this went on for quite some time. Hundreds of years. No support for this man Pilate being an actual political figure. In 1961, an Italian archaeological team working in Caesarea found a stone tablet that measured 32 inches high, 27 inches wide, 8 inches thick. On this slab, now known as the, quote, Pilate inscription, close quote, were the remains of this simple title: Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Basically the same title that Luke gave in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. So, no longer do you have to hear critics say, well, there's no such person as Pontius Pilate. They actually found his name inscribed in stone in 1961. Just one little example of the factual accuracy of the Bible. So, Dan, that leads us into the next slide. You have one. There you go. Our fourth point, archaeological confirmation. Now again, this is one of those subjects that can't treat exhaustively, but we can give a few little examples, tidbits. And of course, archaeology is one of those things that the modern person, the view of the archaeologist comes from where? How do people view archaeology? Where's our picture of an archaeologist most likely to be found? Indiana Jones or Brendan Fraser in The Mummy. Right? Rimmed hat, swashbuckling whip, kind of like, well, who was the guy that played the pirates all the time? Huh? No, not Johnny Depp. Go back a long time before Johnny Depp. Earl Flynn, yeah, it kind of reminds me of Earl Flynn. Indiana Jones is a modern Earl Flynn. Earl Flynn was swashbuckling. I said swashbuckling, I didn't say a drum. That's Johnny Depp, it's a drum. I'm talking about swashbuckling. And that's kind of the way we think of it, but frankly, archaeology is probably, I suspect, pretty tedious, boring occupation.
Yeah. I would call it a boring occupation.
But the things they find are exciting when they find something. Because we like, I think most of us enjoy reading about things they find because it's exciting. It gives you a little window of how, of people's lives in the past. My daughter's, let's see, I guess Chase was a senior in high school. And she took a few years of Latin, and so therefore was in the Latin club. And much to the other parents' chagrin, her and some of the other students talked the Latin teacher into taking a trip to Italy, the club. So we had to pay for, trips to Italy, which I didn't get to enjoy, but both my daughters did. And so they got guided tours of Rome and that kind of thing, which is full, of course, of that type of stuff. In fact, interesting side note, while they were there along the Tiber River, I'm trying to think, I think it was the James Bond movie Spectre with Daniel Craig. They were actually filming a car chase along the Tiber River in Rome while they were there. So they actually saw James Bond, the fictitious James Bond, driving down the Tiber River. But they went to a town near Mount Vesuvius that had been buried by that volcano in about 79 AD, called what? Pompeii. And they've unearthed the whole town. What's left of it. And people, corpses. They were just, not really frozen. I don't know what they call that. The ash buried them and preserved them. But they've unearthed this whole town, Pompeii, modern Roman city. So that's pretty interesting stuff. They got to tour that and take pictures. And we like that kind of thing because we look at that and we say, hey, this is the way they live. This is the way they live. 79 AD is the way, that's the same time frame as the apostles. And our Lord had not been gone back to heaven long. What, 9 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's interesting stuff. So when we ask the question, did the things in the Bible that are recorded really happen? The truth is, archaeology can't always answer that question. There are just some things that you're never going to have evidence, I'm talking about physical evidence for. For instance, there's never going to be any archaeological evidence of Elijah's ascension into heaven. Okay. It's not going to happen. No physical evidence that Christ ever walked on water. It's just not true. But, so to say, well, archaeology can, quote, prove that the entire Bible is true or false is not but it can help prove, sometimes, the Bible's veracity in some areas. And the question is, there's been a lot of, or the fact of the matter is, there's been a lot of significant archaeological finds that have shown the Bible's factual accuracy. So let's look at a few examples. First one I have up there is Hezekiah and Sennacherib. And I think most of y'all are familiar with this account. But let's go over to 2 Chronicles. We'll start at 2 Chronicles 28. Good King Hezekiah took the throne of Judah at a time when, under some pretty distressing conditions, primarily caused, of course, by the kings before him, including his father. His father Ahaz had turned to the gods of Damascus, you recall. He actually cut in pieces the things within the house of Jehovah and shut the doors of the temple. I think Ahaz was the one that was visiting in Damascus and saw this great altar and sent back word, hey, I want one like this, have it ready by the time I get home. And so he sacrificed to all these gods in the high places. You see that beginning in verse 22, chapter 28. But Hezekiah comes to the throne. He takes the throne at the age of 25. Pretty young, pretty king. And he reigns for 29 years. And the Bible says in 2 Chronicles 29, verse 2, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. And so he initiates a bunch of reforms. He reopens the temple, he reestablishes observance of the Passover, appoints the priest to their proper duties and to receive the tithes they're supposed to receive and all that. And even after all he does these good things, which is a good point for us. Now here's Hezekiah. Doing his best to serve God. And people think, well, if I serve God, then really life should be smooth, right? No trials should come my way. I'm exempt from the things that are, and we've already talked about this. We talked about evil pain and suffering. But notice chapter 32, verse 1. After these deeds of faithfulness, talking about Hezekiah. Back up, the verse before says, in every work that he began in the service of the house of God, and the law and the commandment to seek his God, he did it with all his heart. So he prospered. He did prosper. But after these deeds of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself. So after all of that faithfulness, well, here's what I get for it. Sennacherib comes to my front door. And of course, Assyria, being the powerful nation of the day, had subdued a lot of nations already around Judea under the reign of Sargon II. But upon his death, a lot of revolts broke out across the Assyrian Empire, and so Sennacherib decided it was time to show people what for and who was in charge. What was the capital city of Assyria? Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. And so Hezekiah begins to make preparations for this invasion, and one of the things he does, according to, go to 2 Kings, and let's read this before we leave, is if you're going to be sieged and shut into a city, what are you going to need? You're under siege. Yeah, number one, you're going to need water. So what does he do in 2 Kings 20? Look at verse 20. Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his might, and how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? So he cuts a tunnel. Hezekiah's tunnel, it's referred to redirect water into the city by way of this tunnel. And if you go to 2 Chronicles 32, where we were, look at verse 30. This same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah prospered in all his works. That tunnel today is known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. They have found it. It's carved through solid limestone. It meanders in an S shape under the city of Jerusalem for approximately 1,800 feet. In 1880, two boys swimming at the site discovered an inscription about 20 feet from the exit that provided details on how it was constructed. I'll read this to you and we'll close and pick up here next week. And this was the account of the breakthrough. While the laborers were still, this is what the inscription says, while the laborers were still working with their picks, each toward the other, while there were still 3 cubits to be broken through, the voice of each was heard calling to the other because there was a crack or a split in the rock from the south to the north. And at the moment of the breakthrough, the laborers struck each toward the other, pick against pick. Then water flowed from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits. And the height of the rock above the heads of the laborers was 100 cubits. So how far were they underground? About 150 feet. They came at it from 2 directions. They cut a tunnel, it says, of 1,200 cubits, which tells us if the tunnel is 1,800 feet long, that a cubit during the first century, or during the day of Hezekiah, was about 1.5 feet. John Laughlin wrote it as one of the most important as well as famous inscriptions ever found in Judah. And he did all that to keep a steady supply of water during the siege of Sennacherib. You can actually take a tour of that. I've talked to people that have been in that tunnel. We'll pick up there next week. We're not through with Hezekiah.